Good afternoon. My name is Kevin Wolz. I'm in my second semester of my master's in Divinity here at PBA, and I'm going to present a paper that I wrote for a class over the summer entitled, "What Does Paul Say About Women in Ministry in the Letter to the Romans?" I want to thank Dr. Kathy Maxwell, whose idea it was for me to submit this paper to the conference in the first place, and also Dr. Justin Harden, who assigned this paper to me for the class for which it was written, and he was also the sponsor for my submission. This is now the third time that I've had an opportunity to present this paper. The first time was for the class for which I wrote it for. The second time was at one of the monthly meetings for Women at the Well, which meets one Thursday a month in the second floor of Memorial Presbyterian Church. Shameless plug right there. And with each time that I present this paper, I'm given a smaller amount of time to present, but unfortunately, the amount of information that I'd like to share has not decreased. As a matter of fact, since I first wrote it over the summer, I've learned more information about this topic, and I found new ways to build my argument. And so with that being said, I have 20 minutes to share with you guys, and I want to leave time for questions at the end. So I'm going to move right along through this paper and through the different points I have. But before I do that, I want to make a comment about the questions that I am expecting at the end. Whenever this topic of women in ministry comes up, everyone immediately starts thinking, what about my church? Or how does this apply to my church? And what I will say to you is I can't tell you how to run your church. That's not my jurisdiction. So please keep the questions limited to the exegesis or the actual points that I'm making in the paper. And that's all I'll say there. Before I start talking about Romans 16 specifically, it's important that we start talking about some important terms that are relevant to this discussion, and this is how I've defined these two terms. Complementarian refers to a person who holds the belief that men and women are equal in value, but different in regards to their intended roles for ministry and in the household. And an egalitarian refers to the belief that men and women are equal both in value and role. And what I'm going to argue is that in Romans 16, Paul is showing no difference in the roles that the women had in ministry at the church in Rome. And that's what we're going to see. So if you want to look at a text about this, it is Romans chapter 16, and that's what we're going to be looking at. And like I said, there is a great deal of information because in Romans 16, Paul mentions no less than 10 women who seem to be doing ministry of some form for the churches at Rome. And I don't have time to address all of them at length here, so I've kind of split these 8 off into their own group, which I'm calling generic approval, in which Paul uses the same language to talk about their ministry that he uses to talk about the ministry of men in other places in the New Testament. He uses the same types of words there to talk about how these women do ministry. So it seems that he's approving of the work that they're doing in the church. And the first of these women is usually known as Priscilla, but in Romans 16:3, he gives her a nickname, Prisca. And we know her because her husband is Aquila, and it's kind of odd that Paul usually puts her name first instead of her husband's name first, usually. Sometimes he flip-flops on that. In Acts, at least, Aquila is introduced first. But Priscilla, just being named at all, is a little significant, and being named before her husband is very significant. It shows that she not only had a role in ministry, but it's more like they are partners in ministry. She's not just in the kitchen when they're doing ministry all over the New Testament. More importantly, this is the marriage with Priscilla and Aquila is the only healthy example of a marriage that we see in the entire New Testament. Elsewhere, what we see are problems or issues in a marriage. And the only healthy marriage that we see in the New Testament is one where the husband and wife are on mission together as a team. And then Mary, Tryphena, Tryphosa, and Persis there, those three, Paul only talks about them as working hard in the Lord or doing some kind of ministry. Rufus's mother, we don't get her actual name here, but I think it's somewhat significant that she's mentioned here as someone in verse 13 who's been a mother-type figure for many, including Paul, someone who fulfilled a motherly role for Paul. And the only other place that a Rufus is mentioned is in Mark 15, when the Simon of Cyrene carries Jesus' cross. It mentions that his son is Rufus, making it very likely that Rufus's mother would be the husband of Simon, the man who carried Jesus' cross for him the day that he was crucified. Meaning that Rufus's mother was around the Christian community from the very beginning, making her a mother, fulfilling a motherly role, not just for Paul, but for many of the apostles and many of the people who were there from the beginning. There's also Julia and Nereus' sister, and much like some of the others, Paul just gives them generic approval of some form, talking about how they have worked in ministry, they've worked hard for the churches at Rome. And then there's Phoebe, who's in Romans chapter 16, verses 1 and 2, and I'm actually going to read that to you guys. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church in Cenchrea. I ask you to receive her in the Lord in a way that is worthy of his people, and to give her any help that she may need from you, for she has been the benefactor of many people, including myself. Now there's a translation inconsistency here that you might notice depending on what translation you read. Because if you read the ESV, you'll see that she's called a servant of the church of Cenchrea, whereas the Greek word is diakonos, which can mean either servant or deacon. But Thomas Schreiner, in his 1998 commentary on Romans, kind of put the issue to bed when he argued that she should be known as a deacon, not as a servant. And it's worth mentioning that Schreiner usually leaned towards the complementarian side of the issue, but in this case he puts to bed the argument that she might have been a servant, and here's why. She's not just called a servant of the church, he specifically connects it to the church at Cenchrea, making it most likely that she held the actual office at the church. Another issue with Phoebe that we should talk about is it's likely that Phoebe is the one who carried the letter, Paul's magnum opus, Romans, his longest letter, to the church at Rome. And one of her responsibilities as a letter carrier would have been to read and interpret the letter to the Romans. So the first time that all those great passages throughout Romans 3:21 to 26, Romans 5, Romans 4, all of those great passages, the first time they were ever taught, it was by a woman. And not just that, but when the leaders of that church would have had follow-up questions, they would have asked her. It's Dr. Richards, Randy Richards, in his book, talks about how Paul's letter carriers would have been given apostolic authority themselves to deal with any issues as they arose. Meaning Paul would have said, if there's any issues there, Phoebe will handle it. He gave her authority over the Roman churches to teach them his most important letter and to deal with the follow-up issues. And the third thing that we see about Phoebe is that she was a patron or a benefactor of many people, including Paul, meaning in some way he was probably financially dependent on her. She probably funded either the writing of some of his letters, or she probably funded his travels in some way, making him dependent on her. So, and not just Paul, but many others. So what we see with Phoebe is a woman who was a deacon at a church holding a specific office, who taught Paul's most important letter the very first time it was taught, and was a financial benefactor for many people, including the Apostle Paul himself. And then, of course, we have Junia. And there are two significant issues with this woman, and the majority of people kind of just pass over Romans 16:7, not realizing just how much is at stake with this verse. So I'm going to read that to you. He instructs them to greet Andronicus and Junia, my fellow Jews who have been in prison with me. They are outstanding among the apostles, and they were in Christ before I was. Now, there are two issues that we need to talk about with Junia. The first one is, was she really a woman? And the issue there is not with her identity, it's with how we read the word union, which is what we have preserved in manuscripts. In order to save space and to save money when they copied manuscripts throughout the first several centuries of the early church, they would have eliminated accents, breathing marks, and spaces. And they would have written it in all capital letters, leaving us with just the letters iota, omega, upsilon, iota, omega, nu, without any indication to tell us whether or not it should be classified as a male name or a female name. And grammatically speaking, it could go either way. So if it's a feminine name, it would be Junia. If it's a feminine name, or a masculine name, it would be Junius. And the early church considered it to be a feminine name. So that's one plus in that direction. And it wasn't until the late 1800s and early 1900s that anyone wanted to translate that as a masculine name in the first place. But the kicker that tells us that it had to be a feminine name is because the masculine name is a grammatical possibility, but it doesn't exist. Throughout all of history, there's never been an example found of the masculine name Junius on any letter, any epitaph, any tombstone, gravestone, or any writing that's been preserved, meaning that Junius is really just a figment of the imagination of complementarians who don't want to see there be an apostle who is a woman. Additionally, there's been questions about how to translate that phrase there, hoitines esin episamoi en tois apostolos, which in the ESV is read as, they are well known to the apostles, or the NIV has translated that they are outstanding among the apostles. And the difference there is key, because with the first reading, she's not actually an apostle, she's someone the apostles know well. And in the second reading, she's not only an apostle, but she's outstanding among them. She's one of the more significant apostles. And this is, in 2001, Michael Buer and Daniel Wallace wrote an article arguing for the former reading, that they are well known to the apostles. And if you've done a whole lot of reading or study in New Testament or in Greek, you'll know that Daniel Wallace is kind of the authority on all things Greek today. And if he argues for the former, that puts me in kind of a precarious situation. But thankfully, I'm not the only person who's disagreed with the findings of his article. What Buer and Wallace did is they went through every example of early Christian writings where the words episamoi en showed up and tried to argue that all of them meant well-known to as opposed to outstanding among. Now, there are a couple of issues with their article. One, they claim to have found several dozen examples, and in their article, they only showed 6. So they didn't show all their research that they found, and they seemed to be really overconfident with their findings, where it seemed they showed it to be a possible translation, and that's what they showed. Throughout their article, it says it could be this, it might be this, and at the end, they said it's always this. And quite frankly, that's not what the data in their article showed. And I'm not the only one who said that. Richard Bauckham has come out and written against that. Lydia Belleville and several other New Testament scholars have written very harshly and critically against the article that they've written. And they have shown that well-known to is a possible translation on the Greek phrase episomoi es, but in this case, it's probably more likely that it means outstanding among, and that is the more natural reading, that you kind of have to do an exegetical sidestep, if you will, to read well-known to there as opposed to outstanding among. And for those of you who don't have as much Greek training, I apologize if that went over your head. I would encourage you to ask questions about that after and see if I can boil that down a little more. The other issue that we might have with Junia that people have raised is, if Junia was such an outstanding apostle, why is she only mentioned one time in the New Testament? And that's here in Romans 16:7. And to that, I would say, why don't we know more about the ministry, the apostolic ministry of Bartholomew or Andrew or Philip or Thomas or any of the other apostles after they were all throughout the Gospels? Why don't we hear more about them throughout the New Testament? Were they not significant apostles? And what I would say is the reason we know so much about the ministry of Paul, Peter, and John is because they were prolific writers, and the other apostles weren't, including Junia. She just wasn't a writer. That doesn't mean that she wasn't significant. She was significant in the other apostolic duties besides writing letters. And so in conclusion, what I would say is throughout Romans, Paul shows absolutely no sign of being against women in ministry. And as a matter of fact, he affirms them in very significant roles in ministry, including being an apostle and even an outstanding one, and also Phoebe being a deaconess of a church, an actual church, the church of Cenchrea, and he also describes himself as being dependent on her financially, and Phoebe would have taught his most important letter. With that, I'd like to open the floor to any questions, and I do want to remind you one more time, I can't tell you how to run your church based on this. The roles of the church office and what deacons do today aren't really necessarily based on what the New Testament says. There's nowhere in the New Testament does it say what deacons are supposed to do. It just describes what they're supposed to be, and then we see examples throughout the New Testament of deacons doing certain roles, but that's always descriptive, not necessarily prescriptive. So do I have any questions? All right. Thank you guys so much.